Hello and welcome to the next of our full course lectures. In this session we're going to look at a relatively new area to the syllabus surrounding public sector governance. Now we have previously talked a little bit about charitable organisations, but this relates more to public sector. So what do we mean by public sector? Well, we mean that these are goods and services that are not provided by organisations that are private. So we have private organisations and then we have public sector organisations. So these are provided really by the state. So public sector relates to the state. Of course, then you have charitable organisations that we've already mentioned. So examples of public sector organisations. Well, the first one would be the government. And we could subdivide the government. We could talk about the national government. So this is at a national level, for example in the UK, the elected body. So those that are elected to govern us on a national basis. So it's going to be quite a central organisation, but we also then have sub-national government. So this would be regional authorities. So in many countries, these are elected locally. They take control of specific functions that need to be provided at a more local level, and they're called sub-national levels of government. Now, also there would be supranational a level of government. Now, this would supersede the national government. So, for example, the European Union. So that would oversee or supersede the national government. And that is really an organisation that is brought together to try to ensure that national interests don't clash. So they want to try to avoid disagreement and to provide agreement between different governments. So do you understand the difference between national, subnational and supranational government? All of those are public sector. We also have the legislature. Now that forms part of the government in terms of the parliament. So they will actually legislate and bring in laws and regulations. And then we have some other government bodies such as the judiciary who maintain a little bit of independence from the government. And we will talk about some non-government organisations later on in this session. So that's what the public sector is. That's what we're talking about. We're trying to understand what are the differences, what are the particular areas of governance that we need to be aware of surrounding the public sector. So some of those main issues surround stakeholders. Now, it's usually relatively straightforward for us to identify stakeholders in an organisation. Remember, it's those with a legitimate interest. So we're usually talking about the investors, suppliers, customers, banks, government, management, employees. They would all be stakeholders. However, when it comes to public sector, this is a little bit more complex, particularly because of the use of taxpayers' funds. So often the stakeholders could be almost anybody. So we could think of the stakeholders as being the wider public, or they may be those who use the particular service. But even saying that, everyone will have contributed to the funds that will be providing that service. So therefore, it's relatively complex to think about the concept of stakeholders when it comes to public sector organisations. Indeed, it's difficult also to think about the agency problem, because the principles here when it comes to the agency relationship will be the taxpayers or indeed the end users. So when it was our organisation that was a limited company that has shareholders, well, they were the principals and the management acted on behalf of the shareholders. That's not just quite so clear cut when it comes to public sector organisations. Now, of course, the agents will still be the managers, or the government representatives who run that public sector organisation on behalf of the taxpayer. So do be aware that it's a little bit more complex to look at the stakeholders and to identify the agents and principals when it comes to our public sector organisations. Also, when it comes to performance, well, we don't really have the profit measurement. And this is one of the big criticisms of public sector organisations. How do we assess the performance without that profit-making criteria? Well, often they will look at value for money, which you should have met before. Remember, this relates to the 3 E's. The 3 E's being economy, effectiveness, and efficiency. So we would see, are we getting economy from a process or from a service? For example, are we doing it with the best quality at the lowest price? So are we putting the best quality inputs we can afford, or the best quality inputs to ensure that the product at the end or the service at the end is of sufficient standard? Are we getting that at the correct price? And is it competitively priced? This is often a big criticism of public sector organisations, that they don't pay the correct price for the inputs. They overpay for inputs, be that through mismanagement or inefficiency. Then we have effectiveness. How effectively are we providing the service that's required? So that can be a difficult measure to achieve, where we're looking at something like a hospital. Can we look at the outcomes? Can we look at the usage of the beds per patient? How do we assess the effectiveness of that organisation? And the efficiency then. How efficient is the organisation? Again, this is often a big criticism of public sector organisations, that they're simply not efficient enough. So understand that it is more difficult to assess performance when it comes to these public sector organisations because of the lack of a profit-making function. I said we would mention other bodies related to public sector, but not quite. So for example, NGOs, non-governmental organisations. So this is where people with a desired outcome, a common interest, bring themselves together to provide other services not provided by the government. So these people will have that common interest, they will have the drive to try to provide this service. So it could be a humanitarian function, for example, the Red Cross, and they are privately funded with a board of trustees to ensure that the money is spent in the correct way. So similar to charities, but not quite, non-governmental organisations. Some charities may well fit into that type of a description. Also related will be quangos. So these are quasi-autonomous NGOs, so quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations. So these are taxpayer funded. They're not privately funded, but they do hold a degree of independence. They are designed to be independent from government. They are there to provide expertise. That's why we need to maintain the independence. So by having that independence, they can provide a view that isn't clouded. So for example, they're not accountable to government, so they therefore shouldn't feel that they must report in the way that the government wants. However, these types of organisations are often criticised. They're criticised for being unaccountable to anybody because they have that degree of independence. And they also have that blurred reporting. So do they report to the government? Are they reporting to the public? Who are they reporting to? Therefore, it's very difficult to control them and know whether the information coming out of them is correct or if it's clouded by unknown interests. So do know what a quango is and understand that it can be criticised for the unaccountable nature of that type of organisation. So when it comes to the governance of a public sector organisation, there will be an oversight body. For example, a board of trustees. That oversight body will have various roles. They'll be there to ensure that the organisation complies with the rules. So it's a public sector organisation. It will have been established with specific rules and regulations to ensure that it provides the service that it's designed to do. So the oversight body, the trustees, must ensure that that organisation is complying with those rules. That's fundamental to what that organisation is seeking to achieve. They'll also ensure that the KPIs are met. They may well set performance targets for managers. They'll ensure that those performance targets are met and seek explanations if they are not met. In addition, they may well oversee senior appointments. They may well form other committees, so not just the board, but an appointments committee, for example, and oversee through that the appointment of senior managers. That's a very important function, and it's important also to have the independence when that occurs. Ultimately, they will be there to report to the authorities on the performance of that organisation. They're there to represent the authorities and to ensure that whatever rules, regulations and service that is required is provided. Of course, if they are not being provided, well then changes may well be required, whether that be changing the people in the organisation, so removing managers, or bringing others in to ensure that the organisation runs in a more efficient way. So do be aware of that oversight board and understand the role that it has within the public sector organisation. Lastly then, considering the policy or governmental policy when it comes to public sector organisation. There is a continuing argument about the extent of public sector that is required or that there should be within a country. So the argument really centres around whether lots of services should be provided by the public sector, or there should be few services provided with the private sector providing the rest. And that's the fundamental argument here. Should we have a large public sector funded by taxpayers in everybody's interest providing lots of services? Or should we have a smaller public sector using less taxpayer money and letting the private sector provide services? So the fundamental ones here tend to be around the health service. Should that be provided by the government or should it be provided by private sector organisations? And there are arguments on both sides. The arguments for the public sector would be that the state should control key services. So for example, the postal service, should that be controlled by the government? The health service, should that be controlled by the government to ensure that it's done correctly? There's also then the issue of affordability for the people. If we don't provide it by the public sector, there may be a large amount of people who simply cannot afford that service, particularly when it comes to health. Can we be allowed to do that? Can that be allowed to happen within a modern economy? And universal provision. Are there some services that simply must be provided universally to everybody? Again, consider health. Should it be that health is free at the point of use for everybody who is a citizen of that country? So those arguments would be for having the public sector more involved in these services. The arguments against that, well, they would generally centre around the inefficiency and waste that the public sector is often seen to have. So often it's assumed that if it's provided by the public sector, it's provided in a very inefficient way. Sometimes that is justified, sometimes it's not. But that is certainly an argument against more public sector. Improved quality would be another argument to say that, well, if we provide competition, if we have various actors within the market who all provide a service, well, that will improve the quality of the overall service provided. Whereas having it one service provider, the public sector service provider, means that they really have no incentive to improve. Again, on that competition, well, competition may well drive down the price and give value to the public. So if we have several providers all in competition with one another, that may well decrease the price of that service. So just be aware that there are arguments on either side, and generally speaking, it will depend on your political persuasion as to which you agree with. There's no right or wrong answer, but you should be able to argue either. So that was our session on public sector governance. Ensure that you understand the issues around it. You understand the governance of those organisations, and indeed you're able to argue on behalf of public sector organisations or against public sector organisations also.